Everyone turned their backs on the obese girl until the mountain man's shadow fell over her. The autumn wind cut through the Tennessee wilderness like a knife, carrying with it the scent of pine and the promise of an early winter. In the small settlement of Harrow's Creek, nestled between rolling hills and dense forest, the community gathered for their weekly market day. It was 1793, and life on the frontier demanded resilience, but it also bred a particular kind of cruelty, the kind that thrived when people had too little to share and too much fear in their hearts. Martha Hennessy stood at the edge of the market square, her flour-dusted apron stretched tight across her considerable frame. At 19, she had learned to make herself small in ways that had nothing to do with her physical presence. Her eyes, a striking amber that might have been called beautiful in different circumstances, remained fixed on the ground as she clutched a basket of the biscuits she had baked that morning. They were perfect golden, flaky, with just the right hint of butter and salt. But perfection, she had learned, meant nothing when delivered in the wrong package. "Well, if it ain't the Hennessy girl," came a voice dripping with false sweetness. Martha didn't need to look up to know it was Constance Fairweather, the blacksmith's daughter, whose sharp tongue was as famous in Harrow's Creek as her father's horseshoes. "Come to peddle your wares? Though I can't imagine who'd want bread from someone who clearly eats more than she sells." Laughter rippled through the nearby crowd. Martha felt her cheeks burn, but she kept her gaze downward. She had learned this dance well over the years, the mockery, the whispers, the casual cruelty of people who needed someone to look down upon to feel elevated themselves. "Now, Constance, that's unkind," said Mrs. Whitmore, the minister's wife, though her tone carried more obligation than conviction. "We're all God's children. God's children, perhaps," Constance continued, emboldened by her audience. "But some of us show more restraint at the supper table than others." Martha's fingers tightened around her basket handle. She had heard worse, much worse. Her father, dead these 3 years from a fever, had left her with nothing but a small cabin on the outskirts of town and a talent for baking that couldn't overcome the prejudice of empty-minded people. Her mother had passed during childbirth, taking with her any hope that Martha might have a woman to teach her the social graces that might have made her life easier. "I'll take those biscuits," a gruff voice said. Martha looked up, startled. Old Samuel Pritchard stood before her, his weathered face creased with something that might have been kindness. He was one of the original settlers, and age had given him the privilege of saying what others only thought. "How much?" he asked. "2 pennies," Martha whispered. Samuel fished in his pocket and produced the coins, taking the entire basket. "These'll do fine for my supper this week. You make the best bread in 3 counties, girl. Don't let these fools tell you different." As Samuel walked away, Martha felt a momentary warmth in her chest, but it was quickly extinguished by Constance's mocking laugh. Poor old Sam, his eyesight's going, and apparently his taste along with it. Martha turned to leave, but Constance wasn't finished. She stepped into Martha's path, her pretty face twisted with malice. "Where do you think you're going? We're not done with our entertainment." "Please," Martha said quietly, "I just want to go home." "Home? You mean that sad little cabin where you sit alone stuffing your face? Is that where you're headed?" Something in Martha's chest cracked, but before she could respond, a shadow fell across the market square. The conversation died mid-sentence, and heads turned as one toward the edge of the settlement. A man stood at the tree line, and even from a distance he commanded attention. He was massive not in the way that Martha was mocked for, but in the way of someone carved from the mountains themselves. He stood well over 6 feet, with shoulders that seemed to span the width of a door frame. His hair was long and dark, tied back with a leather cord, and a thick beard covered the lower half of his face. He wore buckskin clothing that had seen years of hard use, and a rifle was slung across his back with the casual ease of someone for whom it was as natural as an extra limb. But it was his eyes that held everyone's attention, pale gray like storm clouds, scanning the crowd with an intensity that made people shift uncomfortably. This was not a man of civilization. This was something wilder, something that belonged to the forest and the mountains, and his presence in their settlement felt like an intrusion from another world. "Mountain Man!" someone whispered, and the words passed through the crowd like a prayer or a curse. The man's gaze swept across the market square and then stopped, fixed on something or someone. Martha felt those gray eyes land on her, and for a moment she couldn't breathe. He was looking at her, not through her, not past her, but at her, with an intensity that made her want to disappear into the earth. Then he moved, and when he moved, it was with purpose. His long strides ate up the distance between the tree line and the market square, and people instinctively stepped back, creating a path. He walked straight toward Martha, and Constance Fairweather's face went pale as she hurriedly moved aside. The mountain man stopped directly in front of Martha, so close she could smell the pine and wood smoke on his clothes. Up close, he was even more imposing, and she had to tilt her head back to meet his eyes. There were scars on his face, thin white lines that spoke of violence survived. But there was something else there, too. Something in the way he looked at her that wasn't the mockery she was used to, nor was it pity. It was simply seeing. "You, Martha Hennessy?" His voice was like gravel, rough from disuse, or perhaps from years of shouting across mountain valleys. Yes, she managed. He nodded once, as if confirming something. "I'm Josiah Stone. I've been up in the high country for the better part of 5 years. Your father, Thomas Hennessy, he did me a kindness once, pulled me out of a ravine when I was fool enough to think I could climb it in the dark. Never got to repay that debt before he passed." He paused, his eyes narrowing slightly. "Heard tell his daughter was living alone now. Heard other things, too." Martha's cheeks burned again, but this time with shame of a different sort. What had he heard? The mockery? The jokes? The way people treated her like she was less than human simply because she was larger than they thought she should be. "I don't need charity," she said quietly, surprising herself with the firmness in her voice. Something that might have been respect flickered in Josiah's eyes. "Didn't say you did. I said I owed a debt. Different thing entirely. Your father saved my life. Seems to me the least I can do is make sure his daughter has what she needs to get through the winter. I can take care of myself." "I'm sure you can." His gaze shifted to the crowd that had gathered, watching this exchange with rapt attention. His expression hardened. "But seems to me you shouldn't have to do it alone, not with all these fine Christian folk around." The sarcasm in his voice was sharp enough to cut. Constance had recovered some of her courage, emboldened by being part of a crowd. "Now, see here, Mr. Stone, I don't know what tales you heard, but—" Josiah turned his head slowly toward her, and whatever words she had been about to say, died in her throat. He didn't speak, didn't threaten. He simply looked at her with those storm-gray eyes, and the weight of that gaze was enough to make her take a step back. "I've been in these mountains for 5 years," Josiah said, his voice carrying across the now silent square. "I've faced down bears that would make your nightmares look tame. I've survived winters that would kill a lesser man, and I've learned something out there in all that solitude." He paused. "I've learned that the worst predators don't always walk on 4 legs. Sometimes they walk on 2 and hide their cruelty behind pretty words and false smiles." The crowd shifted uncomfortably. No one met his eyes. Josiah turned back to Martha. "Your cabin's still the one out past Miller's Ridge?" She nodded, not trusting her voice. "I'll be by tomorrow to check on the chimney and the roof. Winter's coming early this year, can feel it in the air." Without waiting for a response, he turned and walked back toward the tree line, his presence leaving a void in the market square that the autumn wind rushed to fill. The moment he disappeared into the forest, the whispers began, but Martha didn't stay to hear them. She turned and walked quickly toward home, her empty basket swinging at her side, her heart pounding in a way she didn't understand. True to his word, Josiah appeared at Martha's cabin the next morning, just as the sun was cresting the hills. Martha had been awake for hours, unable to sleep, alternating between hope and dread. What did this mountain man want with her? Was this truly about a debt to her father, or was it something else? She had learned to be suspicious of kindness. It so often came with strings attached. But when Josiah arrived, he simply set to work. He examined her chimney with a practiced eye, replaced several loose stones, and checked the chinking between the logs of her cabin walls. He spoke little, and Martha found herself watching him from the window as she kneaded bread dough, studying this strange man who had appeared so suddenly in her life. He worked with the efficiency of someone who had spent years relying only on himself. There was no wasted movement, no unnecessary flourish. He was like the mountains themselves, solid, enduring, and utterly focused on the task at hand. By midday, Martha had built up enough courage to bring him a plate of food, cold ham, fresh bread, and a jar of preserves. He accepted it with a nod and sat on the stump she used for splitting wood, eating with the same focused intensity he brought to everything else. "You don't have to do this," Martha said, standing at what she hoped was a respectful distance. Josiah looked up at her, chewing thoughtfully. "Your father ever tell you about how we met?" Martha shook her head. "I came down from the mountains in the spring of '88 looking to trade furs. Got drunk in some settlement south of here, stupid thing to do, and on my way back tried to take a shortcut up a ravine. Fell about 15 feet, broke my leg in 2 places. He paused, his eyes distant with memory. "Would have died up there. It was your father who heard my shouts, climbed down, and pulled me out. Took me to his cabin, this cabin, and your mother set my leg and fed me until I could walk again." Martha felt tears prick her eyes. She had been only a child then, maybe 5 years old. She had vague memories of a large, scary man in their home, but nothing clear. "Your mother," Josiah continued, "she never once looked at me like I was something less than human, even though I was covered in blood and dirt and probably stank like a dead animal. And your father never asked for anything in return. When I offered him pelts, furs, anything I had, he refused, said that's what neighbors do for each other. Josiah's jaw tightened. "I don't forget debts, Miss Hennessy, and I don't abide people who treat others with cruelty for no reason other than their own emptiness." "They're not all bad," Martha said quietly, though she wasn't sure why she was defending them. "No," Josiah agreed, "but enough of them are, and the rest are too cowardly to stand against it. Amounts to the same thing in the end." He finished his meal and handed her back the plate. "You're a fine cook, Miss Hennessy. Your father was right to be proud of you." The words, so simple and sincere, broke something loose in Martha's chest. She had to turn away quickly so he wouldn't see the tears that threatened to fall. Over the following weeks, Josiah became a fixture in Martha's life. He repaired her roof, reinforced her smokehouse, and chopped enough wood to see her through the winter. But more than that, he talked to her, not at her, not down to her, but with her, as if her opinions and thoughts mattered. They would sit on her porch as the autumn days grew shorter, and Josiah would tell her about the mountains, about the vast silence up there, the way the snow looked when it first fell on the peaks, the eagles that nested in the high crags. He spoke of solitude not as loneliness, but as peace, and Martha found herself envying that peace even as she treasured these moments of companionship. "Why did you stay up there so long?" she asked one evening as they watched the sun set behind the western hills. Josiah was quiet for a long moment. "Because people are complicated, Miss Hennessy. Nature isn't. A bear attacks you. It's because you got between it and its cubs, or because it's hungry. There's no malice in it, no cruelty for cruelty's sake. But people," he shook his head, "people can hurt you just because it makes them feel better about themselves. After enough of that, the mountains started looking real appealing." "What changed?" Martha asked. "Why come back now?" He turned to look at her, and in the fading light, his eyes seemed softer somehow. "Because I heard about a young woman living alone who deserved better than what this settlement was giving her. Because I owed a debt. And because—" He paused, seeming to struggle with the words. "Because sometimes the mountains can be too quiet. Sometimes a man realizes that solitude and peace aren't the same thing." Martha's heart beat faster, but she didn't dare hope, couldn't dare hope. As winter approached, the nature of Josiah's visits began to change. He came not just to work, but to simply be there. They would cook together, Martha teaching him the finer points of baking, while he showed her how to smoke meat the way he had learned from the Cherokee. They would sit by the fire in the evenings, and Josiah would read to her from the few books she owned, her father's Bible, a volume of poetry her mother had treasured, and a collection of folk tales that had survived the journey west. It was during one of these evenings, with snow beginning to fall outside and the fire crackling warmly, that Martha finally asked the question that had been burning in her mind for weeks. "Why do you come here, Josiah? Really?" He set down the book he had been reading and looked at her across the hearth. The firelight cast shadows across his scarred face, but his eyes were clear and direct. "Because when I look at you, Martha Hennessy, I don't see what those fools in town see. I see a woman who has survived more cruelty than most people face in a lifetime and came through it with kindness still intact. I see someone who makes the best damn bread in 3 counties, who keeps a tidy home, who works from sunup to sundown without complaint. I see strength, real strength, not the kind that comes from pushing others down, but the kind that comes from standing back up every time you're knocked down." He leaned forward, his elbows on his knees. And I see someone who makes me think that maybe, just maybe, I was wrong about needing to stay in the mountains forever. Maybe there's something here worth coming down for. Martha felt like she couldn't breathe. Josiah, I'm not what men want. I'm not pretty like Constance Fairweather or graceful like the other girls. You're beautiful, he said, cutting her off with such simple certainty that she felt tears spring to her eyes. Not because of how you look, though there's nothing wrong with how you look, but because of who you are. Because you treat a rough mountain man with kindness, even when he probably doesn't deserve it. Because you still have hope in a world that's tried its best to beat that hope out of you. He stood and crossed the small distance between them, kneeling beside her chair. His large, calloused hand reached out tentatively, as if he was afraid she might pull away, and gently cupped her cheek. I know I'm not much, he said quietly. I'm rough and scarred and probably too set in my ways. But if you'll have me, Martha Hennessy, I'd like to stay, not just for the winter, but for all the winters to come. I'd like to build a life here with you, if you'll let me. Martha couldn't speak through her tears, so she simply nodded, leaning into his touch like a flower turning toward the sun. And when he kissed her, gently, reverently, it was the first time in her life that Martha felt truly seen, truly valued, truly loved. Their wedding was a simple affair, held in Martha's cabin with only old Samuel Pritchard and his wife as witnesses. The minister from Harrow's Creek performed the ceremony with visible reluctance, clearly uncomfortable with the whole situation, but Josiah's steady gaze had a way of making people comply. The settlement didn't know what to make of it. Constance Fairweather was particularly scandalized, spreading rumors that Josiah was only marrying Martha out of obligation, or worse, that he was somehow simple-minded and didn't know any better. But Josiah and Martha didn't care. They had each other, and that was enough. As winter deepened, they settled into a rhythm of life together. Josiah would hunt and trap, bringing back game and furs to trade. Martha would cook and bake, and on market days, Josiah would stand beside her, his presence alone enough to silence any mockery. Word spread that Martha's husband was not a man to be trifled with, and gradually the cruelty diminished, replaced by a wary respect. But more than that, they talked. They shared stories and dreams, fears and hopes. Josiah told Martha about his childhood in Pennsylvania, about losing his family to fever when he was just 16 and heading west to escape the memories. Martha told him about the loneliness of growing up different, about the small kindnesses that had kept her going, and about her parents' love that she still carried with her. On the coldest nights, they would lie together in their bed, and Josiah would hold her close, his large frame wrapped protectively around hers. "You're perfect just as you are," he would whisper into her hair. "Don't let anyone ever tell you different." And slowly, gradually, Martha began to believe him. Spring came late that year, but when it finally arrived, it brought with it a transformation. The settlement of Harrow's Creek, witnessing the obvious devotion between Josiah and Martha, began to soften. Some of it was genuine, people seeing their love and recognizing their own prejudice. Some of it was simply pragmatic. Josiah was too useful to alienate. He could track better than anyone. His hunting skills kept the settlement fed during hard times, and his knowledge of the wilderness made him invaluable as a guide. But whatever the reason, the mockery stopped. Constance Fairweather even approached Martha one day at the market, her face tight with what might have been shame. "Mrs. Stone," she said stiffly, "I wanted to, that is, I should have—" She struggled with the words, and Martha could see the effort it took. "I was unkind to you. More than unkind. I was cruel, and I'm sorry." It wasn't a perfect apology, and Martha suspected it came more from social pressure than genuine remorse, but she accepted it with grace. "Thank you, Constance. I appreciate you saying that." As Constance walked away, Josiah, standing beside Martha as always, squeezed her hand. "You're a better person than I am," he said quietly. "I'm still half tempted to chase her into the woods and let her see what real fear looks like." Martha laughed, the sound surprising her with its lightness. "That's because you're still half wild, Josiah Stone." "Only half?" he asked with a rare smile. "I must be getting soft." The following year brought changes neither of them had expected. Martha discovered she was pregnant in the autumn, and Josiah's joy was so pure and uninhibited that it made her cry. He became almost comically protective, refusing to let her lift anything heavier than a loaf of bread and hovering anxiously whenever she so much as felt a twinge. "Josiah," she finally said one day, exasperated but touched, "women have been having babies since the dawn of time. I'm not going to break." "You're my woman," he said stubbornly, "and that's my child. I'll hover if I want to." Their daughter was born on a warm spring morning, with old Samuel's wife serving as midwife. She was healthy and strong, with her father's gray eyes and her mother's amber-touched hair. They named her Sarah, after Martha's mother, and when Josiah held her for the first time, his large, scarred hand so gentle around that tiny bundle, Martha thought her heart might burst with love. "She's perfect," Josiah whispered, tears streaming unashamedly down his face. "Absolutely perfect." As Sarah grew, she became the darling of Harrow's Creek. She had her father's fearlessness and her mother's kindness, and she moved between the settlement and the wilderness with equal ease. Josiah taught her to track and hunt, to read the weather and find her way by the stars. Martha taught her to cook and bake, to read and write, and to stand tall in the face of anyone who might try to make her feel small. But most importantly, they taught her that love came in all shapes and sizes, that true strength was found in kindness, and that family was built not just on blood, but on the choice to stand by each other no matter what the world might say. Years passed. Josiah and Martha added 2 more children to their family, a son they named Thomas, after Martha's father, and another daughter they called Grace. The cabin expanded, room by room, built by Josiah's hands and filled with Martha's love. The gardens flourished, the smokehouse was always full, and their home became known throughout the region as a place of warmth and welcome. The settlement of Harrow's Creek grew around them, evolving from a rough frontier outpost into a proper town. Josiah became something of a legend, the mountain man who had come down from the high country for love. Martha became known for her kindness and her incredible baking, her bread and pastries sought after for every celebration and gathering. But what people remembered most, what they would tell their children and their children's children, was the love between them. The way Josiah would still look at Martha like she hung the moon and stars even after decades together. The way Martha would touch Josiah's hand in passing, a small gesture that spoke volumes of affection. The way they had taken the cruelty the world had offered and transformed it into something beautiful. On their 25th wedding anniversary, the town threw them a celebration. The same people who had once mocked Martha now filled her yard, bringing food and gifts and genuine affection. Constance Fairweather, now married with children of her own, approached Martha with tears in her eyes. "I've never forgotten how cruel I was to you," she said, "and I've spent every day since trying to be a better person. You and Josiah, you showed all of us what real strength looks like, what real love looks like. Thank you for that." This time, the apology was genuine, and Martha embraced her former tormentor with forgiveness that had taken years to cultivate but was now complete. As the sun set on that celebration, Josiah and Martha stood together on their porch, watching their children play in the yard, surrounded by friends and neighbors. Josiah's arm was around Martha's shoulders, and she leaned into his solid warmth the way she had done thousands of times before. "Do you ever regret it?" Martha asked quietly. "Coming down from the mountains, tying yourself to me in this life?" Josiah turned to look at her, his storm-gray eyes as clear and direct as they had been that first day in the market square all those years ago. "Not for a single moment," he said. "The mountains are beautiful, Martha, but they're cold and empty. This you, our children, this life we've built, this is what I was searching for all along, even when I didn't know it. You didn't make me leave the mountains. You made me realize that the greatest adventures don't happen in solitude. They happen when you find someone worth sharing the journey with." He kissed her then, gentle and sweet, and Martha thought about the girl she had been lonely, mocked, convinced she was unworthy of love, and she thought about the woman she had become, loved, cherished, surrounded by family and friends. Sometimes, she thought, salvation doesn't come from becoming someone different. Sometimes it comes from finding someone who sees who you truly are and loves you all the more for it. And sometimes that salvation casts a shadow so large it changes everything it touches. The mountain man's shadow had fallen over her all those years ago, and in that shadow she had finally found the light.